Welcome back, you walking enigmas, you unreadable riddles wrapped in human skin. I need to tell you something you've probably noticed but never fully understood. People think you're mysterious. They use that word specifically. Mysterious, not shy, not quiet, not reserved, mysterious. And they say it with this edge in their voice, this mixture of fascination and frustration, and something that looks almost like fear if you know how to recognize it. But here's what you need to understand. You're not mysterious because you're trying to be. You're not cultivating some aesthetic. You're not playing games or withholding information for strategic advantage. You're mysterious because you're fluent in a language they don't speak. You're operating with information they don't have access to. You're processing reality through systems they don't possess. And that gap between your operational capacity and their civilian baseline creates something they interpret as mystery. But it's not mystery. It's the inevitable result of surviving what you survived and developing what you developed while maintaining enough social functionality to exist in spaces designed for people who never had to. Let me break down what's actually happening when people call you mysterious. When they say they can't figure you out, when they complain that you're hard to read or difficult to know or impossible to predict. What they're actually encountering is the gap between someone who was trained by trauma to operate at levels they can't comprehend and their desperate need to categorize you into boxes that make sense in their world. You don't fit their boxes. You can't fit their boxes because their boxes were designed for people who grew up with safety, who developed with protection, who learned social dynamics in environments where authenticity was rewarded and vulnerability was safe and trust was a reasonable default setting. You learned something entirely different. You learned that authenticity gets weaponized, that vulnerability gets exploited. That trust is a luxury afforded to people whose survival never depended on accurate threat assessment. So you built something else, not a false self, not a mask, but a translation layer, an interface between your operational reality and their civilian expectations. And that interface is what they're calling mysterious, because they can interact with it, they can have conversations with it, they can even believe they know you through it, but they can sense there's something underneath, something they can't access. Something that's running calculations they can't see, and making assessments they can't track, and maintaining awareness they can't match. Here's what makes you mysterious to them. You don't react the way you're supposed to. They tell you something shocking and you process it calmly. Something that should trigger visible emotion produces measured response. Something that should make you flinch barely registers. And they notice. They always notice. Because they're watching for the reaction their nervous system would produce. And when you don't provide it, when you respond from a completely different baseline, their brain flags it as anomalous. You're mysterious because your pain tolerance operates at levels that make their emergencies look like minor inconveniences. They're having a crisis and seeking support, and you're offering it while internally managing situations that would hospitalize them. And somewhere in their awareness, they sense this. They sense that you're not actually struggling with what they're struggling with. That your version of difficult exists in a completely different category. That your baseline for manageable would shatter their entire framework for what humans can endure. They can't articulate this. They don't have language for it. So they call it mysterious. They say you're hard to read. What they mean is that you're reading in a different language and they can't find the translation key. You're mysterious because your threat assessment runs constantly and invisibly. You walk into rooms and within seconds you've cataloged exits, identified potential dangers, assessed every person's baseline emotional state and potential volatility. You've calculated scenarios, planned responses, prepared contingencies. And you've done all of this while maintaining perfectly normal social behavior, while smiling, while making small talk, while appearing completely relaxed. They sense this activity somehow. They pick up on the fact that you're operating multiple programs simultaneously, that you're present in the conversation but also running background processes they can't detect, that you're engaged but never fully surrendered to the moment, that some part of you is always positioned at an angle they can't quite identify. You're mysterious because you speak two languages fluently and they only know one exists. You have the civilian vocabulary, the normal human interaction protocols, the socially acceptable response patterns. You deploy these perfectly, flawlessly, so effectively that most people never suspect there's another language underneath. But there is. There's the operational language, the one that assesses and calculates and maintains constant awareness. The one that never stops running threat matrices and probability analyses and risk calculations. The one that knows exactly how dangerous every person in the room could become, and exactly how you'd respond if they did. And occasionally, rarely, someone catches a glimpse of that second language. They see something flicker across your face, some micro-expression that doesn't match the civilian script, some response that comes from the operational layer instead of the social layer, and their brain flags it immediately, creates a question mark, plants a seed of uncertainty. That's when you become mysterious to them, when they realize there's something they're not seeing, something you're not showing, something that exists behind the interface you present to the world. You're mysterious because you survived things you don't talk about, not because you're being secretive, not because you're maintaining some dramatic silence, but because explaining what you survived requires explaining what it created in you. And explaining what it created requires them to acknowledge that people can develop operative-level capacity outside institutional structures. That trauma can forge capabilities that look like training. That circumstances can build in someone what programs spend millions trying to replicate. And most people can't handle that information. It destabilizes their worldview. It suggests that maybe strength isn't always admirable because maybe strength comes from sources that should never have existed. It implies that the person sitting across from them at coffee might be carrying horrors they can't imagine while appearing perfectly functional. So you don't explain. You simplify, you translate your experience into digestible portions. You downgrade your catastrophes to their inconveniences. You make your survival story sound manageable so they don't have to sit in the weight of what actually happened to you. And that gap between the truth and the translation, that's what they call mystery. That's what makes you unknowable to them. Not because you won't let them know you, but because knowing you requires capacity they don't have. You're mysterious because your pattern recognition operates at speeds that look like intuition, but isn't intuition. You meet someone and within minutes you've assessed their damage, identified their manipulation strategies, cataloged their defense mechanisms, predicted their behavior patterns. You know things about them they don't know about themselves. You see through performances they don't know they're giving. And sometimes you forget that other people can't do this. You forget that reading micro-expressions and tracking behavioral patterns and assessing psychological architecture isn't normal human baseline functioning. It's specialized capacity you developed because survival depended on predicting the unpredictable, on seeing moves ahead, on knowing who was safe and who was dangerous before they showed you definitively. So you say things, make observations, demonstrate knowledge you shouldn't have through normal social channels. And they notice, they wonder how you knew, how you saw, how you understood. And because they can't comprehend the processing you're running constantly, they categorize it as mysterious. You're mysterious because you don't need external validation the way they do. They're constantly checking, constantly seeking confirmation, constantly requiring feedback that they're okay, that they're valued, that they matter. And you're just existing without that need, not because you're confident, but because you built your entire sense of self in isolation. You developed without acknowledgement. You became operational without anyone confirming you were doing it right. So now you don't require their approval. You assess your own effectiveness. You validate your own worth. You know your own capacity. And that independence reads as mystery to people who've never had to build themselves without external mirrors. They watch you navigate rejection without visible damage. They see you handle criticism without defensive reaction. They witness you existing without constant reassurance. And they can't compute it, can't understand how you're functional without the support systems they require. So they call it mysterious, call it detached, call it cold. What it actually is self-sufficient capacity built by someone who never had the luxury of dependence. You're mysterious because your emotional responses operate on delayed timers. Something happens that should produce immediate reaction and you're calm, measured, apparently unaffected. And they think you don't feel, think you're emotionless, think you're somehow deficient in normal human response patterns. What they don't see is that you're processing. You're running the scenario through threat assessment first, determining if the situation requires immediate response or can be addressed after analysis. Checking if the emotion they expect from you serves any operational purpose or just satisfies their need for visible reaction. You feel everything. You feel it deeper than they do because your nervous system was sensitized by years of needing to detect threat at microscopic levels. But you learned that displaying feeling in real time was dangerous, that emotional transparency got weaponized, that showing pain invited more pain, so you developed delay mechanisms, processing buffers, ways to feel fully while displaying selectively. And they interpret this as mystery, as unknowable depth, as something hidden and withheld. You're mysterious because you maintain boundaries they can't map. They push and expect revelation. They probe and expect revelation. They demand vulnerability and expect compliance. And you just exist at your boundary line without explanation, without justification, without the guilt they're trying to install. You learned that boundaries aren't negotiable, that access to you is a privilege earned through demonstrated safety over time. That trust isn't given freely, but built incrementally through pattern recognition that confirms someone is actually safe rather than performing safety. They want immediate intimacy, instant connection, fast-tracked closeness. And you're over here running long-term assessment protocols before you even consider letting someone past your outer defenses. Not because you're damaged, because you're appropriately calibrated for a world that demonstrated repeatedly that trust without verification gets you destroyed. And they call this mysterious. Call it walls. Call it fear of intimacy. What it actually is sophisticated risk management built by someone who paid severe prices for trusting the wrong people. You're mysterious because you exist in this paradox of being simultaneously present and unreachable. You're in the room, you're engaged, you're participating, but some essential part of you remains untouchable, uncompromised, held in reserve, and they sense it. They sense that they're interacting with you but not accessing you, that they're connecting with your interface but not your core. Because your core learned to protect itself. Your core learned that full presence meant full vulnerability, meant full exposure to damage. So your core built layers, built distance, built the capacity to engage authentically without offering access to the parts that can't survive more damage. And people who never needed to protect themselves this way can't understand it. They think you're withholding, think you're playing games, think you're being intentionally difficult. They don't comprehend that you're being appropriately protective, that you're maintaining necessary distance, that you're preserving the parts of yourself that survived everything by never being fully exposed. You're mysterious because you know things you shouldn't know through normal channels. You know when someone's lying before they finish their sentence. You know when relationships are ending before the participants do. You know when situations are dangerous before evidence manifests. And you know all this because your pattern recognition is running constantly, pulling data from sources they don't monitor, making calculations they don't perform, but explaining that you developed near precognitive threat assessment because survival required it sounds insane to people who never needed it. So you don't explain. You just know things, and let them call it intuition or mystery or whatever makes them comfortable with the fact that you're operating with capabilities they don't possess. Here's the truth they can't handle. You're not mysterious because you're hiding yourself. You're mysterious because showing yourself fully would require them to acknowledge what created you, would require them to sit in the full weight of what you survived and what it built in you, would require them to comprehend that operative level capacity exists in people walking around grocery stores and sitting in coffee shops and living apparently normal lives. You're mysterious because the truth is too destabilizing. Because your actual operational reality would shatter their comfortable assumptions about how the world works and what humans can survive and who might be carrying what beneath surfaces that look completely normal. So you let them call you mysterious. You let them wonder. You let them create theories and stories and explanations that make sense in their framework. Because the alternative is showing them something they're not equipped to process. You're not mysterious. You're just operating at levels they can't reach from starting points they never had to occupy. And that gap between your reality and theirs is what they'll never stop trying to solve. But some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some mysteries are meant to be respected from a safe distance by people who have no idea what actually forged them.